All right. So, welcome to the Bullfish Hole podcast. Today we have Dr. Christopher Scheitle, and we're going to be talking about his book, The Faithful Scientist: Experiences of Anti-Religious Bias in Scientific Training. So, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, no problem.
So, you're a sociologist of religion. What got you into this area in general?
That's always kind of an interesting question because whenever I teach, although I haven't been teaching social religion classes in a while, whenever I teach that students always are curious for whatever reason. That particular class, more than I think any other class, or at least most other classes, students always wonder about kind of your own kind of belief system or your own biography. Because I think there's an assumption that if you are studying religion, you must be religious, which is I've always found to be a weird assumption because I don't think we would apply that to other topics. That I always tell people, I was like, just because you study like Nazis, Germany, and World War II doesn't mean that you are a Nazi sympathizer. So, but anyways, all that's to say that I've always been. So I grew up in Texas, outside of Dallas, and I think I've always been kind of interested in religion, even though I did not actually grow up religious at all. My parents never tried to socialize me in any kind of religion. There was no attempt there. And so but there's obviously in Dallas, especially growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was clearly a lot of religious people around me, lots of Baptists and so forth. And so I was always kind of interested in like the people around me doing these things that I didn't necessarily understand or I guess didn't totally understand or was a part of. I remember this is probably too biographical. I remember, in high school, girls that wouldn't date me because I was known as not being religious and things like that. So that was always kind of interesting. So, anyways, all that's to say is I've always been, even though at the time I had no idea what sociology was, I've always been kind of I guess implicitly sociologically interested in religion. And so when I went to undergrad, I actually went to undergrad with the intent of being a high school history teacher. And kind of quickly, my first semester realized that I didn't want to do that anymore. And in a purely coincidental, like luck thing, my first year seminar, we were all assigned at the school I went to, we were all assigned to a first year seminar, this year long kind of liberal arts reading and writing sort of thing. And I just happened to be assigned to a sociologist named Michael Curl. And he would end up becoming kind of like a mentor. And I think that's when I became I had no idea what sociology was. I didn't know that people studied society in some way. Like I didn't know that was a thing. And so when I became aware of that, I think those two interests kind of merged. I was like, hey, I really like this field, and I kind of am interested in religion. And so those two things sort of merge. Yeah. And so I guess that's kind of the background. And I'll say also I was a double major between sociology and religion. And actually, I had kind of a secondary mentor in the religion department named Mackenzie Brown. And he's actually interested in religion and science. And so I took a class, probably somewhat unusually as an undergrad, took a class that was all about religion and science. And so I think all three of these things, like the religion and science aspect, the sociology aspect, and just kind of the general social religion, have always kind of been there, and they just kind of merged, I guess, over time. I guess that's my answer to that. That's a very long-winded answer to that question.
That was a great answer. And it kind of took care of my follow-up question, which is what led you to study religious scientist in particular. So you've always had that interest in the relationship between religion and science.
Yeah, but I think as an undergrad, I was really interested in, I think, the things that people assume that you're interested in when it comes to religion and science, kind of like the theological and the historical kind of tensions and debates and things like that. And I think I was really interested in that stuff as an undergrad. And then as I've grown up or whatever, I think I'm kind of less interested in those because I think they're still interesting intellectually in some way. But I think at some point I kind of became like, well, there's no answer to these things. Like, I don't know, you can debate this stuff. I mean, people literally have debated some of these questions about for centuries. And so at a certain point, I got kind of bored with that. And I got more interested in sort of the actual people, like how are people actually sort of managing or thinking about kind of religion and science. And so then again, I guess it became less of a historical theological interest and more of a sociological interest. And I think religious scientists have always been, I think, kind of a natural focal point for social scientists who are interested in issues of religion or issues of science, and then the larger kind of debates. I don't know to what extent your audience is familiar with these long sociological debates about secularization, but it was basically this idea that as the world becomes more scientific, it'll become more rational and therefore less religious. And scientists have always been seen as kind of the canary in the coal mine of that process. That scientists, because they're most exposed to religion, most exposed to science and kind of rational thinking, so to speak, they should be the least religious. And so going back to the early 20th century, you have people who are studying kind of the religiosity of scientists, trying to test essentially, hey, are scientists all atheists, as many people might expect or assume? And so I think that's kind of that interest in religious scientists. That's not unique to me by any means. I think what maybe is unique to me, at least in terms of this book, is looking at sort of emerging or nascent scientists, specifically grad students, because there's a lot of work that is focused on faculty. And I think one of the things that interest me about grad students is a couple things. I guess one is that when you only focus on faculty, you're kind of missing a big part of the population, because not all people who train in science become faculty. In fact, the minority of people who get PhDs become faculty. And so all the studies that have focused on faculty are potentially kind of missing part of the story, or a big part of the story about what's happening. The other thing that's interesting is that grad school, as you know, is a very, and as someone who didn't know anything about grad school before I went to grad school, neither of my parents, again, getting back to biographical stuff, neither of my parents went to college. And so when I got my bachelor's, they just assumed I was done. That I was started talking about grad school, and they were like, "Wait, what? Like, there's more college? What are you doing?" But anyways, grad school is a very interesting kind of sociological environment, because people are really immersed in kind of not only a very closed bubble, often socially and kind of culturally, but grad school is very much meant to kind of create an identity in you. You know, I think if anybody graduated with a PhD in whatever discipline, whether it's biology or sociology, and they didn't sort of have an identity shift into thinking of themselves as a scientist or as a biologist or a sociologist, and I think most grad programs would see that as a failure, because grad programs are not just about sort of teaching you technical skills and knowledge. It's really at its core about kind of creating a professional identity in you. And so anyways, I thought studying this kind of issue of religious scientists among individuals who are kind of in the early or in the midst of this kind of creation of identity would potentially be really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. And so you're focusing in your research on graduate students, scientists in training. And are we talking, when we talk science, are we talking just the hard sciences, or what sort of disciplines are you considering here?
So yeah, the question of who counts as a scientist is a whole other. I remember one time I sent out a survey, and it was funded. The survey, it was not for this book, it was for a previous project, and it was funded by the National Science Foundation. And one of the survey respondents wrote me back and basically asking, why is the National Science, and they put it all in bold, why is the National Science Foundation funding this? Because there's this idea that sociology isn't a science. Anyways, these are things I could talk about on tangents for a long time. But the very quick answer to your question is that this particular project and what's featured in the book, there's 5 disciplines. There's kind of your 3 core natural science of biology, chemistry, and physics. And I also included 2 that kind of cross the border into the social sciences. So you have psychology, which is sort of interesting because it's kind of on this borderland. A lot of psychology is modern psychology is very much kind of natural sciences, neuroscience, and things like that. But there's also parts of psychology like clinical counseling, psychology, and so forth that are still kind of in the, I guess, social science domain. And then sociology was the 5th discipline. I partially included that just because I wanted to be able to talk to other sociologists and grad students in my own field while doing this. So it was kind of a personal selection. But also it kind of went one, if you think of psychology is kind of on the border, sociology is kind of one step over into, I don't know if you think it was pure social science or not. But yeah, those were the 5 fields: physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and sociology.
And so, how did you locate people to talk to in these fields? How did you sample these people?
Yeah, no, that's so one of the nice things about studying for academic scientists, so grad students who are in universities and also faculty, especially faculty, is that most grad departments, research departments, have a directory, right? Like they always have a directory of faculty. I can't think of any departments that don't have a listing of their faculty. And most of them, I would say 9 out of 10, have a directory of grad students as well. And so when you're doing, it actually makes it really nice to create kind of what we call sample frames for these populations, where essentially what we did in this study is we took the top 60, I think it was the top 60. Now my memories, I think it was the top 60 departments in each of these 5 fields. And that's as defined by US News rankings, which, we can have a separate discussion of, are those rankings meaningful or not? But we took the top 60 and then we randomly selected 15 departments in each field. So 15 in biology, 15 in chemistry, and so on. And those were stratified. So we had 3 that we selected from the top 15 and 3 from 16 to 30 and so forth. And so then from those departments, what we did is, and I say we because it was me and a grad student, some undergrads that were working with me. We then went to those department websites and literally spent a summer building a database of all the grad students that were listed as part of those departments. And we ended up with, I have to look back at the specific, I think it was like roughly 8,000 entries in that. And so biology is a much larger field than sociology. So I think sociology, we had maybe 1,000 students, and then some of the other fields were different. And then from each of those fields, we then selected randomly from that 800 students per discipline. And then which means this might be too much in the weeds, but then that implies that we oversampled for sociology because sociology grad students had a much higher selection or chance of being selected, which we then, when we did analyses, we weighted essentially each discipline. So they kind of get back to the population percentages.
And so you've got your sample of graduate students from these various disciplines. And I guess the next question that would occur to me is how many of these people are religious, which really there's a second question involved in that, which is how do you tell, like what counts as being religious?
Yeah.
So how do you measure whether they're religious or not?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question as well. We always talk about in sociology that religion is a multi-dimensional concept, which basically means that, when we talk about religiosity, we're talking about things like public practices, like attending religious services. We're talking about private practices like private prayer. We're talking about beliefs like belief in higher powers or gods or God. We're talking about sort of identity and organizational membership. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of classify someone as more or less religious. In the survey that we sent to grad students after we selected these 800 per discipline, we had kind of a variety of measures that get at these different dimensions. So we asked students, do they identify with a religion? Do they identify as Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or whatever it might be? We asked how often do they attend religious services? We asked about prayer frequency. And then we asked kind of just a general, like, how religious of a person are you? With, I think it was like 4 or 5 categories, from very religious to not at all religious. And when you look at those different measures, kind of, however, and not surprisingly, they're tend to be pretty correlated, right? So people who think of themselves as very religious or moderately religious, are tend to be more likely to sort of identify with a religion and attend religious services or pray and all that kind of thing. So it's not that these are completely distinct dimensions. They overlap quite a bit. And when you do kind of look at these measures, what you find is that regardless of kind of how you look at it, whether it's belief in God or the religion, do you identify as religious? It kind of boils down to about 1 in 5 of the students can be kind of defined as religious. So about 1 in 5 identify as moderately or very religious, or about 1 in 5, attend religious services somewhat regularly. The religious services one was actually the trickiest. I don't know if trickiest is the right word, but it was kind of the most misleading one, because we also did interviews. So we did a survey, but we also did over 60 long form interviews with grad students. And what I found is that a lot of grad students, even if they were religious by other measures, were not necessarily attending religious services, partially because of time. They were very busy and they were like, I'm pulling 80-hour weeks in this lab. I can't really do religious services. And then some of it was that they hadn't really found a religious community in the university town that they were going in. And so the religious attendance measure probably underestimates a little bit more than the others. But roughly about 1 in 5 or about 20% of the students could reasonably be classified as, fairly religious is what we found.
And what sort of faiths or denominations were represented in this sample?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to. I probably should have looked to refresh my memory about specific percentages. But of the religious students, so of that 1 in 5, I think it was something like 60% identified as Christian, and obviously that's a very broad category. And then I think it was maybe a quarter, 20%, maybe 25% were Jewish, and then I think there was like 8 or 9% that were, I guess, if we broadly think of kind of Eastern religions like Hindu, and I don't know if we would consider, I don't know if Muslim would probably not be considered Eastern, but basically kind of non-Judeo-Christian, I suppose. And yeah, so I think that was roughly the distribution.
Was there variation in the nature or degree of religiosity across the disciplines?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Actually, there's been a lot of debate. So all these studies that have studied faculty, religiosity among faculty, there's been this ongoing debate about kind of disciplinary patterns. The original assumption was that I think a lot of people would assume that natural scientists, because I guess they're more sciencey, they should be the least religious, right? And then actually there were some surveys maybe 40, 50 years ago that actually suggested that social scientists appeared to be the least religious. And there was some debate about why that might be. Some people argued that it might be that essentially social scientists, because they are less sciencey, are trying to overcompensate. They're like, no one really questions whether a physicist is a real scientist. And so therefore a physicist can have like more leeway to be religious and a physicist because it doesn't really conflict with their professional credentials, I suppose. But, if you're a sociologist, people don't really buy you as a scientist in the first place. Now, if you're a religious sociologist, well, then that's even worse, right? Because it's like, well, you're definitely not a real scientist at this point. And so there was kind of this argument that social scientists, because they're essentially trying to overcompensate for their lack of scientificness, are less religious. Now, more recent studies, like studies in the last 15 years or so, have not really found kind of any differences or any clear differences between natural and social scientists. There is a more clear difference between what we might think of as like pure sciences and more applied fields. So like health sciences and things like that tend to be more religious than kind of like your just physics or chemistry or biology or sociology. But that argument between natural and social has kind of faded away. And in fact, in my own data of these grad students, I don't really find any clear disciplinary differences. There is no kind of clear social versus natural difference or anything like that. So generally speaking, it's roughly that 1 in 5 in each of the disciplines.
Another question that comes to mind is, do you find variation across types of institution? Because, colleges and universities aren't all of a piece. Some are small, some are big, some are super prestigious, some are farther down the scale. Is there any variation across those?
So, yeah. So there's actually a parallel debate. So we have this kind of this argument about disciplinary differences. And there was also another debate in the sort of 1960s about, so the only other survey of graduate students in sciences that I know of was done in the 60s by somebody named Rod Stark, who's a well-known sociologist of religion, who actually passed away, I think, last year or the year before. But anyways, in the 1960s, he did a survey of some grad students in science. They actually weren't even just sciences. It was just grad students, period, across disciplines. And one of the things that he found in his survey was that students that were at more prestigious institutions were less religious. And he kind of has arguments about this, that one of the things that he argues is that the sort of mindset that's required and the dedication that's required to sort of, get to Princeton or something like that tends to be sort of contrary to kind of like, a religious life, I suppose. Anyways, but in my particular data, I don't actually find, and I will say as a caveat that all of my students were in top 60 departments. I think there very much is a difference between like a top 10 department and a 50th department. That being said, I mean, those are all relatively prestigious compared to like a 200th ranked department. So it's possible that if I had sampled much lower, right, like sampled, the hundreds and rankings and things like that, that maybe I would have found that. But I don't actually find any difference between kind of the tier of institution and level of religiosity. So one way to measure kind of, I guess, prestige is kind of the ranking of their institution. I also asked students in the survey how many publications have they been a part of, as publications are obviously kind of a standard measure of like probably a misguided measure, but it's kind of a misguided measure of like, I suppose, talent or whatever ambition I suppose we have in academia. And I didn't really find any evidence that religious students or non-religious students differ in kind of their productivity as grad students. So I really didn't find disciplinary differences or kind of prestige differences in religiosity.
And the other source of variation, I think, that would come to most people's mind is across individuals, like with demographic categories. I know you had a piece in The Conversation recently, and one of the lines in there was that you found in your sample people who were women or Black were more religious than the others in the sample.
Yeah. So yeah, we do find gender differences that compared to those who identify as man, women are more religious. It's not a huge difference. I mean, it is what we call statistically significant, but in terms of like actual percentages, it's just like a few percentage points. So it's not overwhelming. There is a much kind of larger substantive gap when you look at race and ethnicity that compared to white students, students who identify as Black are much more likely to identify as religious. That's regardless of how you measure religiosity. And you also find some difference with those who identify as Latino or Hispanic compared to white students. Not as dramatic as the white-Black difference, but there is a difference there. And so, yes, the religious students are somewhat more likely to be women and much more likely to be non-white is kind of the punchline there.
Is that a larger difference in society, or is that just in the students?
No, that does parallel. There's a long line of research showing that women tend to be more religious than men, and there's a lot of debate about why that is. I won't get into that because it's a separate topic. And there is, I mean, most surveys, most data would show that for the most part, there are exceptions in particular ethnic groups and things like that. But most studies or most data would show that non-white individuals tend to be more religious than white individuals.
Interesting. So I guess now we should move on to the subtitle of the book, which is People's Experiences of Anti-Religious Bias. In your survey and in your interviews, what sort of these experiences did you uncover?
Yeah, so I think what most people would assume, I think, at least my assumption about what other people would assume, which is it's a double assumption, which is probably a bad path to go on. But I think most people would assume that religious scientists, whether we're talking about faculty or grad students, we would assume that they must be sort of torn internally about like these kind of historical theological debates, that it must be really difficult for them to balance out these things. And what I found is that the students that I spoke with and surveyed, it's not that they hadn't thought about these things. And in many cases, they were quite eloquent and had read quite a bit about religion and science and things like that. So it's not that they were like ignorant of these kind of conversations or debate, but in terms of like their own personal view and struggles, like it really wasn't an issue. They had all kind of come to terms, if they had some period where they had struggled with like evolution or something like that, they were no longer struggling. They had found kind of some resolution. And I think there's lots of different ways that people resolve these kinds of potential conflicts. And so that really wasn't like that. Those kind of classic religion and science issues did not define kind of their experiences in grad school as a religious individual. What really defined kind of their experiences was much more social, cultural, and a little bit of psychological, I guess I would say, in that. So you're talking about 1 in 5 students is by no means an inconsequential minority, right? I mean, you're talking about 1 in 5 students. although I'm not, I don't know, I would ever want to say like some minority is inconsequential. Like this percentage is low enough that we shouldn't care or something. I don't think that would ever be the conversation. But 1 in 5, it's kind of it's small enough to be ignored by a lot of people, but large enough that you're talking about a sizable group. And so a lot of the students would talk about, because they were relatively in the minority in terms of religion, that it sort of created an atmosphere where it felt like the 4 in 5, the other side, the non-religious students and faculty, felt pretty free to sort of riff negatively about religion and religious people in kind of the classroom or in the lab space or office space or in kind of social settings and things like that. And many of the religious students I interviewed, they assumed that they were the only one. They were the only religious student. And whenever you feel like you're the only one, it's really hard to speak up, right? I mean, there's lots of research that shows, it's hard to be the lone person who speaks up in a crowd. People do that, but it is socially difficult and psychologically difficult to do that. The funny thing is that given that most grad programs might have like 70, some of these larger programs might have 70, 80, even over 100 grad students, especially some of the biology programs, it's extremely unlikely that they are the only religious students. Right. There's probably others, but the problem is that they can't really connect with each other because all the religious students are essentially concealing their identities. They're afraid to be sort of exposed. I remember one particularly, noteworthy interview I did. There was a student who was religious, basically said that they didn't reveal that they were religious until they were like in year 3 or 4. And they had really thought about they had this whole like mindset about how they essentially didn't want to be judged, on day 1. They wanted to sort of establish themselves as like a real scientist or scientists in training before anybody kind of judged them for that. And so in a lot of the interviews, people talked about like, these kind of derogatory comments about religion. I suspect a lot of these comments were kind of offhand things, like people would kind of make a joke about, oh, well, we should pray about it or something like that. So they're probably things that people like don't realize are maybe problematic, especially because they assume that everybody is on the same page, right? Like I talk in the book about kind of this culture of assumed atheism, that everybody assumes that we're all not religious, right? We're all, and maybe all be not religious, and we probably are all kind of like angry atheists, right? Which is not actually the case. Even among the non-religious students, most of them are not what you would think of as like Richard Dawkins types. But there is kind of this culture of like, we assume you're not religious. You wouldn't be here if you were religious, essentially. Yeah. So I'll stop there. I don't know. That was a long answer to your question, but I don't know if you have.
Well, that was a good answer. And yeah, I've heard those sort of casual digs at religion from colleagues before.
Yeah. And so, most of what the students reported was like kind of these like informal interactions that sort of played into this culture that you shouldn't be, that religious people are either dumb or aren't welcome. And there were a few cases where students would report things that we would think of as like classic, like accommodation discrimination issues. Like I remember one, can't remember the discipline. I think it was a biology student, talked about how his department had scheduled like a retreat on the weekend. And, it was more or less assumed that it was required to go to this retreat. And, some of the students, there was a couple, actually in this case, there was a couple students in this department who basically raised the issue of, well, this is kind of overlapping religious services. Can we get out of it and things like that? And there was kind of a hubbub in this department about that. And I remember another Muslim student talked about, she was a psychology Muslim student, talked about basically like food being served, that was cooked in alcohol. And she asked for some accommodation for that. And there was a big hubbub about that where, people didn't want to accommodate that. But for the most part, it wasn't these kind of accommodation issues. It was much more kind of interactions, informal social interactions that created this kind of culture, I guess, as the book title says, anti-religious bias, I suppose.
Yeah, I think some other people pick up on that too, because when I mentioned, without mentioning the title of your book, I just mentioned I was interviewing someone who studied religious scientists, and I got a question from a psych professor. How do they cope with a hostile work environment in academia that's contemptuously ignorant about religion? What sort of coping mechanisms did your subjects have? How did they deal with this perception of assumed atheism and all that stuff?
Well, I think a lot of what students would do would be to conceal their, and you see this in my survey data and also in the interviews. A lot of students talk about concealing their identity, which makes sense because I mean there's other research in like areas of race and gender and so forth that talk about identity concealment, which is a natural kind of strategy, or it makes sense to conceal this identity that is stigmatized or discriminated against. The problem the problem with concealment is that there's also a lot of research that shows that it actually in some ways causes more problems than the original problem. That people who conceal an identity, whether it's their sexuality or their religiosity or whatever it might be, they might do so with the intent that, hey, I want to feel like I belong more to this group, so I'm going to hide this other part of me. What actually ends up happening though is that they feel that concealment leads them to feel even less belonging because partially because they can't feel like they can fully commit to this group, or they start to feel resentful of the fact that they can't kind of bring their whole self to this group. And so concealment was a common thing that people talked about, even though it maybe was not always a great or effective mechanism. The religious students also differ in some other ways from kind of the non-religious students, where they tended to have stronger networks outside of their graduate program. And some of this is through faith communities. So they're participating in a congregation, either back home or at their university. And so some of that coping is coming from the fact that they have these connections outside of their program. The other thing is, I don't know if you have a question about this later, because there's a chapter in the book about it. The religious grad students were also much more likely to have families. So you see this in the survey data, much more likely to already have kids in grad school, already be married in grad school. And so having that family life, a lot of them in the interviews would talk about, their family and larger communities being kind of big supports while they were in grad school.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. How did having a family, and grad school can be a very isolating process and a very almost, I want to say totalitarian, but a consuming process. So how did people manage that with having already formed a family?
Yeah, and I think having the family was, I think, a huge benefit for many students, because families they can provide you perspective that maybe this class paper or this article that got rejected is maybe not that big of a deal in the big grand scheme of things. But it also presents a lot of practical challenges when you're in grad school, which there's a huge literature about kind of work family issues in academia. Most grad students might be making at best, if they're lucky, 20 grand as a research or teaching assistant. And so financially it's very difficult. Time wise is very difficult because if you are expected to be in a lab for long hours and you have young children at home, that's obviously very challenging. The other thing is that when some of these students were thinking about post graduation and what their career plans were, the students with families, which are disproportionately religious students, but not exclusively religious students by any means, having a family when you are thinking about your career path adds another variable, a very difficult variable, because if you're thinking about academic jobs in general, again, I don't know how much your audience is familiar with academia and academic job markets, but it's very geographically limiting. You basically take the job that you can get, and you don't necessarily get to pick where you want to live. And so if you have a partner who has their own career, or if you have kids and you want your kids to be in a particular area, becoming an academic might not be the best option because you're giving up some of this geographic options, essentially. In fact, what I found in the survey data, one of the articles, I talk about this in the book as well, but it was also a standalone article. One of the things we found is that the more importance that students place on their family life, the less likely they are to want to pursue sort of a research-focused academic career. And because religious students are more likely to put more emphasis on their family life, that in turn means that religious students are less likely to say that they want to pursue kind of research-focused academic careers. They do not, however, interestingly, religious students that does not mean that they put less emphasis on their career, because I asked a series of questions about kind of their interest in career status and prestige. And there's no religiosity effect there. So it's not that they're less committed to their careers. It's just that they are more committed to their families, I suppose is the way to put it.
Just to try to sum up or to flesh out anything I might have missed, what would you say is the main thing you learned from this research, or maybe the main thing that surprised you from this research?
Well, one is I'll say I very much enjoyed doing this project. I think I especially doing the interviews with grad students, that I enjoyed my time in grad school a lot, but now I'm kind of a jaded faculty member and, like burnt out sort of faculty member. But, I think talking to these grad students, I really enjoy sort of seeing their kind of passion and talent and things like that. And I think it kind of rekindled, I don't know, I could see kind of the flame, in these students, both the religious and non-religious ones. So that's that. I guess I'll say that, and I say in the acknowledgments, sort of, as a thank you to the students who participated in this project. I don't know if it's a surprised me, but one of the things that I've thought about since kind of writing the book and kind of wrapping up the project for the most part is this large, and I talk about this in the conclusion of the book, is kind of thinking more about what do we mean about like diversity in science or diversity in academia, and where does religion kind of fall into that? And I've been thinking more broadly about like, what is the place of religion among the other, we refer to like protected classes, right? Like we have kind of a list, there's a federal list of protected classes of age and race and disability and so forth. And religion's kind of an odd entry in that list, at least in a contemporary sense, because it sort of made sense historically because religion is so much tied to kind of ethnic background and things like that. But as it becomes more and more kind of and this is not universally true. It still does have strong ethnic and racial ties in some cases, but it's definitely lost that kind of tie. And so where does religion fall into kind of the diversity landscape, and to what extent should science and academia more broadly think of it as kind of a relevant dimension when they're talking about kind of diversity programs and things like that? And so I don't have an answer necessarily for those things, but it's something I've been thinking a lot more about. This book has kind of made me think more about. And what I say in the conclusion of the book is that you can't really talk about diversity in science. In my view, you can't really talk about it without at least somehow talking about religion. At the very least, you have to recognize that if you are sort of driving out individuals who are more religious, you're probably disproportionately harming some of the very groups that many diversity programs are trying to help. Right, because we talked earlier about sort of non-white students and women students being more religious. Well, that means that if you kind of create this hostile environment towards religion, you're sort of disproportionately impacting those groups, which I don't think is kind of the intent. So obviously, a lot of programs are meant towards increasing diversity there. But I think also setting aside that, I think there's a reason to think of religion as a useful dimension of diversity in and of itself. So we just talked about like this issues of family life. And there's all these discussions in academia about kind of work-life balance and being family friendly and things like that. And religious academics could be kind of natural advocates or natural agents of advocating for policies and also just cultural changes that facilitate more of a family-friendly workplace. The other thing I would say is we didn't talk about this so much, but I do talk about it a little bit in the book. The religious students I interviewed, and there's some evidence of this in the survey data as well, have a somewhat different kind of outlook about their work and the importance of their work and how to go about their work of science, that is. Some of them talked about in the interviews that they don't see science as being kind of like the end all and be all of things. I guess I would say they have a little bit more of a holistic view of kind of scientific research and its place in the world. And some of these conversations, some of the things that they say, which is motivated by kind of their religious faith, I think could be useful and beneficial in academia and science more broadly. And I'll say the caveat, because I'm sure someone listening to me say this will say, well, you don't have to be religious to think those things or to have that worldview. And that's absolutely true. But there is a lot of research that shows that these kind of attitudes and worldviews are kind of more likely or to be influenced by religious traditions and religious faiths. And so, yeah, I think I forgot what your actual question was, but these are the things that I've kind of been thinking about and kind of the, I guess, my biggest takeaways from this project.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for agreeing to talk to me today. I know you have a lunch date coming up, so I'll go ahead and wrap things up. But for the listeners, Dr. Scheitle's book, The Faithful Scientist, is available on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description. Anything you'd like to add, Chris?
No, I enjoyed talking about it. Like I said, this was probably my favorite project that I've done. And so I like talking about it. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.
All right. Thank you, man. And thank you for listening.